Good morning, everyone. I will now call the hearing to order. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Treaty 1 territory and a traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. This morning I will be chairing the hearing. My name is Robert Hutchings. On my direct left is Ms. Nesbitt. On my far left is Mr. Sneesby. The assessor representing the Assessment and Taxation Department is Mr. Dupuis, and our secretary today will be Ms. Rohl. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that applicants or the assessor make at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by council and is independent of it and the city administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with this board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by cross-examination by the appellant and then the panel members, and then the appellant's testimony followed by cross-examination by the assessor first and then the panel members again. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions based on evidence presented today. You will receive the order by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. And can everybody please put their cell phones on silent before we begin. Good morning, Mr. Dupuis, Mr. Newman, and Mr. Boardroom.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Bellin, would you mind swearing the assessor and the appellants in first, please?
Please state your full name.
Brian Paul Dupuis.
And you swear the evidence about to present the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I will.
Thank you. Please state your full name. And you swear the evidence about to present the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please state your full name.
Bradford Scott Boardroom.
And you swear the evidence about to present the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Brad, Mark, do you want to get some water first?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, the first property on the docket today is 900 St. Mary's Road. And my understanding it is that we are dealing with three issues this morning: value, classification, and liability. Is that correct?
Those are the issues in appeal. We are not, in fact, in both the files this morning, we are not arguing quantum.
Okay.
So the issues on both properties will be limited to liability to taxation and classification of property, which follows the liability.
Okay. So, in that instant, I guess you'll be going first, is that correct?
Sure.
Yeah. Can you please, since even though we're not dealing with the quantum, can you give us a description of the property and everything as the assessor would when we start?
Address, roll number, or the physical description?
Well, both, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. The address of the property is 900 St. Mary's Road. Here's on realty roll number 0800292500. The file number is 18530. Property currently used as a, what I would describe as a mixed facility. It houses both the administrative offices of the Louis Riel School Division, as well as a significant portion of it being used for student and schools, student support services, that sort of thing. And I'll get into more detail about those in a minute. The property is actually comprised of 3 separate sections, if you will, and if you, I don't know if I have the right pictures. If you look at page 9, on the top picture, you'll see there sort of 3 distinct components. You'll see one on the right-hand side. That's a structure that is used as a conference center for the school division, and I'll get into some of the uses that it's put to. The middle section there, it's the 2-story structure with the basement, is the former Norbury Junior High. And then the sections, the single-story sections to the very left were an add-on to the property in or around 1961, when it was at that time a school. As I indicated at the onset, this particular property houses both the offices of the Louis Riel School Division, as well as a number of student support services. The outline of those are shown on page 3. So that there is the non-administrative student-related functions, and they indicated the conference center, which they have, or which they call or refer to as the Legacy Conference Center. The centralized services in this location, each school division has developed a model of centralized services to maximize efficiencies within their own individual divisions. In this particular location, they have student support services, which provide support at the student, classroom, and school levels with planning that guide the educators in identifying student needs, providing programming supports, and monitoring student processes or progress. Library services located within this structure provides resource materials for teaching staff. There is a central print shop which provides centralized digital printing, duplicating and finishing services. That includes binding as necessary for a large variety of classroom operational documentation. They house all of their information systems within this structure. That would include hosting the division's networking needs for each of the schools. It also includes a centralized facility for the purchase and repair of divisional computers, which are used within the schools, and certainly for the division offices as well. All network services, including email, web, and web filtering, are provided through this department. And we'll go through some of the pictures in a moment. They house also workplace safety and health, home economics, and industrial arts planning, direction and implementation for the safety and health of students and employees, which would include obviously the teachers, and support for both the home economics and industrial arts programs within the school division. There is also an area that provides curriculum support in here within the structure to ensure that instructional programs meet the learning needs of all students and operate within the division's guidelines. Now, the school division has provided us with their breakdown on page 4 of the uses of these various areas within this 3-part structure. We, based on those calculations, including prorated, You'll see there that there is some that are mixed between administrative and school support. So we calculate the area for which we seek an exemption here for student-related, non-administrative functions, 20,336 feet, or 41.5% of the gross floor area. That includes the conference center. So if we just take a quick look, starting at page 10 and following, you'll see a couple of street level exterior shots there. Page 11 shows the interior of the main part of the conference center, the Legacy Conference Center. Page 12, you'll see a bit of the seating area as well as the conference center again. Page 13, again, different view of the seating area just outside conference area itself. Page 14 shows the upper picture is a picture of the library support services area. Again, providing support for these schools. The centralized print shop at the bottom. Page 15 shows some of the student support services areas. Page 16, you'll see the network services and information services areas there. Page 17, again, more of that. The top picture, the locked door there, is actually an IT closet where they house their servers. Certainly, it's a matter of standard practice to ensure that those areas are secure, certain hours is. You'll see there some at the bottom also for the network services and information services. And you'll see on page 18 a number of the laptops being prepared, laptops and ultimately desktops as well, being prepared for distribution for use within the schools. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Mr. Newman.
Thank you.
So there's a separate brief that I have provided, which is titled Exemption Submission. And I'm going to work you through that a little bit. And as Mr. Borgstrom has noted, in respect of this property, because there is a combination of different uses, a full exemption is not being sought, but rather an exemption of 41% is being sought, as laid out in Mr. Borgstrom's page number 4 of his material. And it's a function of the square footage, and it's a function of the allocation of the square footage between what I will explain to you further is services that are needed for the public schools, for the needs of the public school, as opposed to services that relate purely, or space rather, that relates purely to the administration of the school division. So let me then start you through my materials. At the bottom of the first page, I talk about the legislation. And I've given you the legislation at tab 1 of my materials. But if you go to the top of page 2, the relevant legislation is there for you. And section 22(1) of the Municipal Assessment Act says that subject to sections 25 and 26, real property is exempt from taxation levied by a municipality other than for local improvements where the real property, and then subparagraph D, is used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act. So, and I haven't taken you into tab 1 yet. I'm just working on page 2 of the text of my material because it's laid out for you there. Yeah, so I think we're on page 2 of that material. And at the top of page 2 of that material, you can see the excerpt from the Municipal Assessment Act. And so the magic words are, is used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act. So if the real property is used for that purpose, then it is exempt from taxation levied by the municipality. The Public Schools Act defines school building, and you see that in the middle of page 2, as including buildings used in a school division for the imparting of instruction. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a building where students are actually being taught. But remember, the definition goes on to say, and it's bolded and underlined, or for offices or other public school purposes. And so what we are saying to you ultimately is, what is going on in 41% of this building is used for a public school purpose. And I'm going to speak to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And therefore, it is caught within the exemption. The latter half of that definition says, but does not include a building or part thereof constructed or used solely or chiefly for administrative functions of the school division. And that's why we acknowledge, as Mr. Borgstrom said, that parts of this building are used for purposes of administration of the school division, and therefore we do not seek an exemption in respect of those parts of the building. So that is the starting point for this discussion, is that we have to bring ourselves within the exemption that is found in section 22(1)D on the basis that this real property or a portion of it is used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act. And as I say to you, the definition of school building is quite expansive because it uses the word includes, so it includes buildings used for offices or other public school purposes. Now I have to tell you one other thing. I have to tell you about the French version of the legislation. And I have to tell you at the outset that in Manitoba, both the English version and the French version are equally binding and equally authoritative. And every so often, we get a circumstance where the language of the two of them is not exactly the same. And we have that in this case here. So the Manitoba Court of Appeal has already spoken about this issue in a case involving the Winnipeg School Division in 2014. And if you go to the top of page 3 of my material, the court in the Winnipeg School Division case noted the difference between the French and English versions of section 22D. And at paragraph 26 of the decision, which is found in the materials I've given you at tab 2, the court said, the English version indicates that real property is tax exempt where it is used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act. The French version indicates, and this is the important part, the French version indicates that real property is tax exempt where it is used for the needs of a public school. Used for the needs of a public school. So it's different in the sense that it talks about the needs of a public school. And I can tell you that I have made this presentation before Mr. Therian on a couple of occasions, and he always makes a point of saying, show me please the French version, and he looks at the French version, he says, yes, that's right, it says needs, and Mr. Laurendeau has done the same thing when he's heard some of these matters. So, but again, the point I want to make to you is that in Manitoba, each version is equally authoritative, and the reason that is the case is because the Interpretation Act of Manitoba in section 7 says the English and French version of acts and regulations are equally authoritative in accordance with section 23 of the Manitoba Act 1870. So going back to Manitoba Act of 1870, they decided that both versions would be equally authoritative. So, what do we have happening here? Let's now turn to the factual presentation that Mr. Borgstrom has provided to you, now that I've given you the legal context. He has explained to you that, and if you look at page 3 of his materials, in the lower half of that page, he's explained to you that there's a variety of functions that go on in this building that are all about the students and supporting the students and supporting the process of education that goes on within the actual school buildings. And, you know, I say this when I make these presentations, of which I've done many now. And everybody in this room is probably old enough to remember, except probably perhaps the secretary. When we went to school, the school system was a lot different. In many ways, it was simpler. It's become a much more complex operation. We didn't have psychologists in the school. We had a guidance counselor. We didn't have speech therapists. We didn't have audiologists. We didn't have all of those things when we went to school. There weren't computers in the schools, of course. There wasn't a need for the support services to make sure the computers function and run. When we needed a test run off, and I hate to say this, there was a Gestetner machine in the office with a crank that would go around, and they'd run off multiple copies of the test we were going to write. Well, we don't do that anymore, of course. We have centralized print shops now to make efficient the process of creating the resources. Was there a library in the school? Frequently. Did the teachers have their own library? No, they have that now because there are library resources. And when we come to the next property, we're going to talk more about this. But this is common throughout the school divisions now, where there are these buildings that house a variety of resources that are used to support the schools. And I say to you simply, if curriculum support or library services for teachers, if any of those things were actually in the school building, I do not believe the assessor would be saying that portion of the building is not entitled to the exemption. What creates the issue here is that it is in a separate building. So I think we all need to understand that the nature of school operations and what school boards and school divisions do in terms of providing the appropriate environment. School boards and school divisions have an obligation to provide an environment that is safe and conducive to education. They have an obligation to provide the resources to support the mental well-being, the physical well-being of students, and they have an obligation to provide all the resources that are necessary to provide education at the level that our society expects it to be provided at today, with all that means in terms of diversity of students, diversity of their backgrounds, diversity of their needs. So with that in mind, by way of context, if you look at page 4 of Mr. Borgstrom's material, you can see that there's been a breakdown done which categorizes the various areas of the building, the square footages for which are all identified as either being administrative, in which case no exemption is being sought, or relating to school support, in which case the exemption is sought. And for a couple of those, there's been a split. So for example, in the middle section, there's an item called Information Systems, and you'll note that there's 4,085 square feet that are associated with that. That's being split 35% to administrative support, therefore no exemption, and 65% to school support, and therefore the exemption is sought. At the end of the day, there's a total of 20,336 square feet itemized at the bottom of that page, which calculates to 41.5% of the area. And again, as you can see, curriculum coordinators, curriculum, library and arts, student support services, those things are all treated as being in support of the schools. Payroll and human resources and archives are not. The library services, the central print shop, the workplace safety and health, the home economics, the industrial arts program supports, the curriculum healthy living, those are all treated as being part of the school support aspect of what goes on in the building. And it all comes back, as I said to you at the beginning of my presentation, look at the legislation, look at the definitions in the legislation, look at page 2 of my materials. Property is exempt where it's used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act, or in the French version, used for the needs of a public school. I don't think there can be any doubt that these areas that we're speaking of are used for the needs of the public school system. They're not industrial arts, home economic support, curriculum and healthy living. Those are not administrative aspects of a school division. Those are used for the needs of the public school system. And again, within the English version, the definition of school building within the Public Schools Act, buildings that are used for offices or other public school purposes fall within the definition of school building, and therefore on that basis, we say to you that either on the English version or on the French version, we fall within the language of the exemption, and we are entitled to an exemption of 41%. And then the last thing I'll point you to is if you go to page 6 of my submission, there's a section titled Conclusion in the lower half of the page. Right at the bottom, I give you some sections from the Interpretation Act, in particular sections 6 and 7. Every act should be interpreted as being remedial and given a fair, large, and liberal interpretation. And then at the top of page 7, section 7, as I referred to earlier, the English and French version of the acts and regulations are equally authoritative. And on the basis of that, the French version used for the needs of a public school is equally authoritative. Just in terms of the tabs, just so you understand what I've given you, tab 1 is legislation. It's excerpts from the Municipal Assessment Act. The pages are numbered in the lower right-hand corner. And then there are excerpts from the Public Schools Act as well, beginning at page 16 of tab 1, and those provide to you the sections I provided. Tab 2 is the Manitoba Court of Appeal decision that I referred to earlier. If you go to page 11, actually, if you go to page 10 of that decision, tab 2, page 10. So tab 2, page 10, at paragraph 24 is where the Court of Appeal starts to talk about the comparison of the French and English versions. Paragraph 24, finally, while it was not argued in this appeal, the interpretation of section 22(1)D is supported by a comparison of the English and French versions, and then they repeat the English and French versions in paragraph 25, and then in paragraph 26 at the top of page 11, which I read to you earlier. The English version indicates it's exempt when it's used for a public school. The French version indicates that it's exempt when it's used for the needs of a public school. So that's why we say to you, when you look at the French version, clearly the portions of property of which we speak are used for the needs of a public school. And then finally, tab 4 of my materials is a number of decisions of different panel members of this board where exemptions have been granted. And in fairness, I must say to you that different panels have not always granted the exemption. And I must also say to you that the city has challenged these decisions to the Court of Queen's Bench, which is where liability challenges go. So the city has challenged these. But what you have here are different types of properties. So 1395 Spruce, for example, Cowles and Goldack and McFadyen, that is what I call a maintenance construction service type building where the exemption was granted, Winnipeg School Division. The next one is 1397 Spruce, same type of operation. 901 Maginot, a little bit of a mixed use there in terms of maintenance and construction support. And then finally, 150 Moray is a property where that's what I call a resource property. And it's very similar to 50 Monterey, which we're going to come to next, in the sense that a lot of resources for the teachers in terms of counseling and support for students is found in 150 Moray. It is not a construction maintenance type of building. Yes. And on that site, there are two separate buildings, one of which is an admin building. No exemption was sought for that building. But the building that is the 150 Moray building is a resource building, and the exemption was granted. So that's what I want to say to you about this issue. My submissions in relation to 50 Monterey will be very much the same. I will not repeat them in the full detail that I have this one.
Okay. Mr. Borgstrom, any breakdown on the numbers you're requesting exactly, and the value?
I didn't actually go through the manual calculations. Yeah, I think he's looking for the monetary assessment.
I'm sorry.
So I can, you're looking for a breakdown of the assessment, right?
Yes, please, yeah, what you're requesting to
Yeah.
change from other to class code 40 institutional and class code 60. That's based on that 41% ratio.
So we would be seeking a split of $961,000 as 40E or institutional exempt.
961,000?
Yeah.
Okay, and the balance, you accept the 2,316,000?
Yeah, so that works out to $1,355,000 as Class 60 or taxable other.
Okay. So, okay. Now we have those numbers. Okay. Anything else to add? All right, thank you. Mr. Dupuy, any questions on the presentation by the appellants?
couple.
Okay,
Just a couple.
thank you.
And I guess I'll just kind of direct Brad on his issues and Mark on his issues. So we had spoke prior to hearing. We really determined between the two of us that there's no changes over the last couple of cycles with respect to 900 St. Mary's or 50 Monterey.
I don't understand when you say no changes.
Well, there was no physical changes, nothing that required inspection.
Well, when I attended 900 St. Mary's a few weeks ago, the basement area of the former school building had flooded, and it's undergoing a restoration at the present time. So they've shuffled some things around.
Okay.
And to my knowledge, well, and we haven't gone to Monterey yet, but to my knowledge, that remains the same, I believe.
Okay. Sorry, page 3 of your brief. Couple of spots here, I guess. Middle of the page, the subject property is currently used as office buildings with areas housing both Louis Rail administrative offices, administrative student-related services or functions. Is that opinion or is that fact?
The non-administrative student-related functions?
Yes.
Well, I've laid out the facts in the section below that that's bullet pointed.
Yes.
That's factual.
Okay, thank you. And those are like the student support, library central, curriculum.
In it, that was, that's our submission. But more than that, the Legacy Conference Center space is also, it's used primarily for seminars and teachers in services, special events, professional development. So it's a, as I said, that's the former, what I would say, gymnasium.
Gymnasium.
Yeah, and it's now turned into the Legacy Conference Center.
Yes. So I have no more questions for Mr. Boardroom, and I just have a couple questions for Mr. Newman. So we went through your brief, your submission. You pointed out a couple of things there. This is your evidence. I just wanted to draw attention and see, on tab 3, this was the Queen's Bench decision with respect to the issues. And last page, page 19 of the decision, para 41, I think we all agree that they find the parking lot of Sister McNamara schools exempt from taxation under the MMA, and the appeal to the Winnipeg School Division is allowed. That's correct, right?
Yes.
We're not arguing, correct?
We're not arguing.
No, no. So the parking lot of Sister McNamara School is exempt.
That's what the decision was about.
Correct. Thank you. Page 2, I guess, of your sort of initial intro, page 2, speaks to the school building, school site. You spoke to the legislation. Is there any disagreement here today between the parties that the intent of the legislation is to, in fact, make the school division liable for taxation with respect to certain functions?
I would answer it this way. The result of the interpretation of the legislation is that certain aspects of the operation of a school division, buildings that are used solely or chiefly for administrative functions, will not be entitled to an exemption, but buildings that are used in support of what I'll call the student-related operations of a school division or the student-related operations of a school building will be entitled to an exemption. You can't have a school building operate, and it doesn't arise in this case particularly, but a school building has to be safe. The equipment, the furniture in a school building has to be safe. So those properties that support the safety of the building, repair and maintenance, the safety and utility of the furniture, like 1395, like 1397 Spruce in the Winnipeg School Division, have been granted exemptions. As I say, the construction maintenance aspect arises a wee bit in Monterey, but does not arise in the context of this building. So the end result of the legislation, I believe, is that buildings that are used purely for administrative purposes of the school division at large, or portions of those buildings, are not exempt. Buildings that support the needs of a public school, to use the language of the French version, or buildings that are used for offices or other public school purposes, to use the language of the English version, are entitled to the exemption.
Okay, thank you. Just want to focus in, you mentioned the maintenance, the safety aspects here in your response. The maintenance facilities should, I guess based on your presentation and the liberal interpretation and the French interpretation, which is equally, and we agree is equally authoritative, it's for the needs of the public school. So any contractor that does maintenance on a regularly scheduled maintenance for the school divisions should be exempted as schools. Their facilities, their maintenance facilities should be exempted as schools.
Like an electric.
Heating, ventilation contractor that has long-term contracts with the school division, electrical companies,
No,
bus service companies,
no,
no?
no.
Okay.
Because that would be the same as suggesting, for example, that my office, because I provide legal advice to a school division, should arguably be exempt from taxation, because I'm giving advice to a school division. And I say to you, no, the legislation does not go that far. What the legislation deals with is buildings occupied by school divisions.
But if we support the liberal interpretation for the needs of a school division,
Yes.
or a school, public school, for the needs of a public school, arguably, there is no aspect that isn't for the needs of a public school.
I don't agree with that. I think that's an extreme interpretation, which I am not suggesting.
Okay. So you would agree then that the definition or the context needs to be narrowed more specifically?
Well, from the example you've given, I don't agree with the width of what you're suggesting.
Okay. And just at tab 2, the Court of Appeal decision here. And this is your evidence, Mr. Newman. And sorry. I just note on page 5, paragraph 12, that the courts looked at hospitals and schools, and that's also reinforced on page 7, paragraph 17. Or rather, yeah, paragraph 17, just under regarding Southwestman. The administrative office fell within the exemption allowed to hospitals under 22(1)E of the MAA which uses the same language exemption for public schools under 22(1)D. So on page 5, paragraph 12, page 7, paragraph 17, and page 9, paragraph 20, they refer to hospitals and schools, suggesting there's the same language. They're really,
No.
in there, they're using
No.
it interchangeably?
No,
No?
they're not using it interchangeably at all. So let's go to tab 1 of my materials, where the legislation is provided. And let's go to page number 6 in the lower right-hand corner of tab number 1. So the way the legislation is structured is you have the preamble, subject to section 25 and 26, real property is exempt from taxation levied by a municipality where the real property, and then you get a whole series of exemptions. So now let's turn the page to page number 7 in the lower right-hand corner. And let's look in the left column where we've got the English version. And you see subparagraph D and you see subparagraph E, because that's what you're asking me about. You're asking me about D, public schools, and E, hospitals.
Yes.
And you're suggesting they're the same. And the only part of it that is the same is the maximum land area that is exempt, 4.047 hectares. That is the only thing that is the same. There's nothing the same about it in the context of the, what I'm gonna call the operative language of the school exemption section, which is subsection D, used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act, or of course, the French version, which is found at the top of page 8. So there's nothing the same about them in subparagraph E at all, beyond the reference to the maximum area of the exemption.
Right, thank you for that clarification. And I'll just touch on tab 4, and certainly appreciate your openness with respect to these decisions.
Yes.
They are industrial in nature, maintenance facilities in some cases, storage compounds.
The 2 Spruce properties and the Maginot property, yes.
Yes.
150 Moray, no.
Resource.
Resource,
Yes.
it's offices, it's
Yes.
supportive resources for the schools.
Yes, under appeal,
Yes,
higher court. And the city has, Altus has some, the city definitely has some properties appeal. We definitely see some conflicting decisions.
yes.
I have no further questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dupuy. Lynn, any questions?
I just want to follow the train of thought so it's clear in my head. You're not arguing that this is a school
No.
under the Public Schools Act. It's not a listed school by Manitoba Education,
That's
or
correct.
is it?
It's
I'm
not a
sure.
listed school.
It's not a listed school. There's no specific instruction in the school for students.
Correct.
But you're saying that there is a public school purpose for this building.
Yes,
And that public school purpose defines it as a school building, or because of what it's used for, it is a school building, therefore, that's where the exemption comes in.
so that's correct
Yes,
on the English side of the matter?
on the English side.
Yes.
Yes,
And
which
on
is
the-
all I can read.
I understand.
Yes.
But what we all have the benefit of what the Court of Appeals said.
And it says that used for the needs of a public school.
Right.
So it's used for a public school purpose, or, well, under I'm just looking at the definition of the PSA,
Yes.
and it says other public school purposes. Is it the same in the French? Do you know?
No, it's not the same.
Okay,
That's why The Court of Appeal commented on it.
No,
Oh, the definition of school building?
yes,
Oh, I truthfully don't know.
okay. I was just wondering
Yes.
if it tracked through
Right.
in the same way from the MA in the French? Okay.
But yes, that is that's the logic of the argument.
That's the logic. And you're using square feet as a proxy for splitting the assessment.
Yeah, and that's not unusual. I can speak to that. There are many instances where class codes are split, including exempt class codes are split. One example I can think of that we worked on, I hesitate to say decades ago, at 3074 Portage Avenue, which is the Lutheran Church of Canada. And some of it was agreed to be designated as church property and some of it not. So there we have one building, one occupant. Then we split out the differing uses. Another example would be the Grand Memorial Baptist Church, which also houses a school. We worked on that one a lot of years ago as well, and we actually went through the exercise of splitting out the different components of that structure. One roof, a number of different uses within there, and so an allocation by square footage is not at all uncommon.
And is supported, I'll go one step further, by the legislation. So remember that the preamble to section 22 says, subject to section 25 and 26. And if you go to section 26, which is page 14 of my tab 1 in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see section 26. And it says, where a portion of a building is used for a purpose for which an exemption from taxation is available under section 22, which is what we're saying, the exemption applies to a portion of the taxation, A, that applies to the building in the same proportion as the used portion bears to the building as a whole.
Thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you, Lynn. Mr. Sneesby, any questions on the appellants?
Just one, okay. This property, is this the school division headquarters property as well as the school? Is, like the portion that is exempt is only being shown as 41%.
Right.
If it were just a straight school, it would be 100% exempt, I would think.
That's correct. And as we indicated, I hope clearly in our description of it, while one of the portions of the structure used to be a school, it is no longer. And this now houses both the administrative offices of the Louis Rail School Division and what we'll call student support services. And we've outlined those different occupancies on page 3 of our brief at the bottom, and it's bullet pointed there. In addition to the Legacy Conference Center, which has a use or is primarily used for seminars and teachers in services, special events, and professional development. That would be teachers within the school division.
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, and you broke down the square footage to come up with 41.5%.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question. I just made that assumption, but I just want to confirm it. Thanks.
Anything else? Jerry?
No, that's it.
I do have a couple of questions. I'm just doing a quick calculation here. If you bear with me 1 second, please.
Can I ask a question, Amanda?
Of course.
The Legacy Conference Center, is
Yeah.
that used for any student uses, or is it strictly teachers and seminars for teachers in services, that sort of thing?
Other than the, well, let me answer it this way. Other than the annual general meeting of the division, as I understand it, it would be my suggestion that the other uses would involve support for the schools, for the needs of the schools, certainly teachers and services, professional development. The property, one of the properties we've talked about today, in a sort of ancillary fashion, is actually a professional development center, which was granted the exemption by this board. So the, let me give you a further example with schools for school uses. There are activities that go on within the school, certainly within the evenings. We used to rent them for my son's winter league soccer practices. There are schools that are occupied by scouting groups in the evenings. Those are not teaching uses, those are not school uses, but still the schools receive the full exemption. So the fact that there is a very small sliver of the use that isn't education related or school related doesn't change the fact that they're granted an exemption by the city.
But the primary use of those facilities is the gym and used
And
for
the
school
and the
purposes.
primary use of the Legacy Conference
And
Center.
that's what I'm trying
Yes,
to understand,
yes.
what is its primary use and who is the primary user?
The primary use, as I've been able to understand, is it's used primarily, it's in page, or on page 3, sort of in the middle of the page there.
Yeah,
So
seminars and teachers
and
and
services,
services.
yeah. Professional development, which is teachers. So.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. That was my question, but I would, that represents 50% of your request for establishing that 41% ratio. So on page 3, regarding that Legacy Conference Center.
Well, let's back up for a second. It's not half of our request.
Well, it's 10,000 square feet out
Of
of
the
20,000.
20.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was thinking about the whole area.
No.
Yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
quite right, yes, yes.
It says special events. We've established it's not a school. So when you say special events, is it solely used for the school division, or is it?
Let me, I did
Purposes.
pull a couple of things off. Did I print them out and put them in here? So one example of a particular session that was held in that facility was an information session, early childhood transition to school for children with additional support needs. Okay, so it's dealing with school children, and it goes on to describe, and it was a half-day experiential and informative session, and brought in a number of, or brought in a multidisciplinary group of people to talk with the attendees about this. Target audience included student service coordinators, resource teachers, child care directors, and disability service providers and family support workers. So it included some of what we would describe as school, for the needs of the school with teachers and so forth, but it wasn't limited solely to that. That was one example. And I had a few others as well. There was an anxiety and stress in youth. It was a mental health forum for parents. It was in there as well. So there are a number of different uses, and that's sort of just a cross-section of things that were held in there, other than the teacher's professional development there in services.
Okay, so you gave an example of soccer teams. Is it available to the school division schools to rent out, to use as a meeting area? That wouldn't be considered.
The Legacy Conference Center?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I can tell you that it was a nominal rent, because I was involved with the two examples I gave. There was a nominal fee to use the space for the year or the length of time that we had booked the space for.
I guess what we're trying to get at, I think both of us, Lynn and I, are, is whether it's solely used for supporting school staff, or is it also used, or is it also available to the school division, I guess the schools in the division, to use for other purposes? That wouldn't be clearly support.
No, but it's used primarily, and as indicated, it's on page 3, it's used primarily for those purposes that I've outlined here.
All right, so that's all my questions. Mr. Dupuy, when you are ready, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quantum's not at issue. Let's start at page 11 of the assessor's brief. And this is just really going to confirm and or show the board that the appellant and the city assessor are basically on the same page with respect to the facility, the physical facility. Where we may differ is with respect to the definitions that are under legislation and what constitutes an administrative function of the school division. So page 12, this is the facility, the physical entity. It is the Louisville School Division offices at 900 St. Mary's. 12 and 13 are just exterior shots. Page 14 shows the basement janitorial, the board and trustees chambers. Page 15 is just the circulation through the facility. Bottom of page 15 shows main floor administration. Similarly on page 16, page 17, international student administration offices, second floor administration, human resources, payroll, etc. Page 18 is basement staff area. Page 19 shows a basement and their IT area, and shipping and receiving lift. Page 20, basement circulation, just stairwells, hallways. At page 20 is the teacher support, industrial arts, human ecology, French services, workplace health and safety offices. Page 22 is the conference center, teachers in services, school board, AGMs, just as I know the question was asked. What was related to me is there was some limited student activity, and I guess within the Louisville School Division, those kids that were fortunate enough to perhaps go to a festivities downtown would meet here, get the what for and on courtesy, et cetera, and away they would go. So it was sort of used as a staging area. On the one time that I inspected it, that was an example where the students did in fact attend this site, and it was used again just as a staging area for the bus and down to the MTS center. So we're not, we're going to be forthright and upfront and say that was the extent of student activity in there that was extended to us during inspection. Page 24 is breakout rooms used by the division for teachers, training, etc. And page 25 is just the outside, the old gym or the Legacy Center now. But again, it is the school division's board offices. Page 26 and 27 are a list of the schools within the Louisville School Division. This is not noted as a school. This is their board offices. Page 28 gets into the legislation. And this is legislation that Mr. Newman has been very thorough on. So the Municipal Assessment Act, Part 6 is liability, and it speaks to, again, to sections 25 and 26, real property is exempt from taxation, levied by a municipality other than for local improvements where real property is used for a public school within the meaning of the Public Schools Act, and we'll acknowledge used for the needs of a public school under the French. Interpretation, equally authoritative. So what's a public school? Well, we go to the Public Schools Act, and the Public School means an institution for educational purposes. So, not totally helpful. But if we go to the Education Administration Act, it speaks to a private school. And that means any school other than a public school which provides a curriculum and a standard of education equivalent to that of public schools. So now we know a school is a place students attend, they provide a curriculum and a standard of education. Page 29, if we look at 41(1)(b)(1), it states that one of the duties of the school board is to ensure that each pupil enrolled in a school within its jurisdiction of the school board is provided with safe and caring, controlled environment, fosters being respectful and responsible behaviors. I think we've touched upon that. It's important that they are in a safe and environment. But what we acknowledge here is that there are pupils in schools. So now we're really focusing this down to a bricks and mortar facility, a school. B3, ensure that written policy respecting school food and nutrition is prepared for each school. And looking at page 31, the Public Schools Act, a school building includes the buildings required or used in a school division or a school district for the imparting of instruction or for the offices or other public school purposes, but does not include a building or a part thereof constructed, designed, and used solely and chiefly for administrative functions of the school division or school district other than those exercised by principals and teachers. So, what does this say? Well, it's basically telling us that within that school, within that actual bricks and mortar thing, you're going to have administrative offices. You're going to have the principal's office, the school office. Nobody ever wanted to be called down to the office, right? Those are exempt. That's the principals, the teachers' rooms, the librarian's office, the gym teacher's office, the offices and spaces dedicated to school psychologists that visit the school. They have their location. These are all exempt under this. Additionally, with respect to that school site and that school building. Where you have a school, you may have additional or other buildings such as offices required by the school. You may have residences, teachers' residences or students' residences on that site required by the school. You may have storage facilities on that site required by that school. You may have one of them, you may have all of them, you may have none of them. These are the definitions that basically come down to being schools. Curriculum, etc. Well, if we look at page 29 of the assessor's briefing, this is the Public Schools Act, Part 3, Powers and Duties of School Boards, Employees of School Divisions and School Districts, and the Duties of School Boards. If we look at 41(1)(a)(1), provide, as may be directed or prescribed by the minister, appropriate educational programming for every, and then pupil enrolled. So that's a responsibility that establishing a curriculum, etc., is a duty of a school board. It's a responsibility, it's an administrative function of a school district and a school board or a school division, as indicated in the Public Schools Act. If we turn to page 30, look at the bottom O, the school division, and the duties of school boards. The school division is to select and purchase or rent school sites and premises and build, repair, furnish, keep in order, and regulate the use of the school buildings, lands, enclosures, and movable property. Again, pretty straightforward that the administrative aspects in any maintenance facility is a requirement of the school division. It's an administrative function of the school division. It is not associated with any particular school. Page 32, 33, 34, and 35 are decisions from the last two cycles with respect to this property. Similar, these are appealed currently, outstanding matters at Queen's Bench. And starting at page 36, this is the Court of Appeal, Manitoba decision. It can also be found, of course, in the appellant's brief. And this was with respect to a parking lot that was off-site. And in the simplest terms, it was found to be exempt. It was not exempted under anything other than the definition of the school building or a school site. It fell squarely within the definition. It was a parking lot associated with a particular school, as given in testimony this morning and under question and answer. That parking lot was associated directly with a particular school, Sister McNamara. So it's not receiving an exemption as a freestanding building outside in an industrial park somewhere. It's part and parcel of the integrated complex of that school. And it's simply that. It's not the Winnipeg School Division. And this is really reinforced if we turn to page 44 of my brief, which would be page 9 of the decision, para 21. And it says in this case, the Winnipeg School Division is not attempting to rely on the legislation to expand its exemption, nor is it attempting to classify the parking lot that would invoke new exemption. In other words, they're going, it's under the definition, we're just requesting the exemption it's entitled to. Turning to page 42 of the assessor's brief, which would be page 7 at the top of the order. And Mr. Newman clarified this, but I think it's important to read this. Are we okay?
Yeah, continue,
We
please.
can take a minute?
No, go ahead.
We're good? Okay, sorry. So, at paragraph 17, it says, regarding Southwestman, she observed, this is the legislation, this is the authorities used in determining the exemption liability on this school parking lot. The issue was whether the property that housed the applicant's administrative offices fell within the exemption allowed to hospitals under 22(1)(e) of the Municipal Assessment Act, which uses the same language as the exemption for public schools under 22(1)(d). Looking at subparagraph 16, a more reasonable interpretation, looking at the act as a whole, is that the definition of hospital is, 1, inclusive in nature. The maximum exempted area allowed under 22(1) implies that freestanding buildings included in the definition of a hospital are part of an integrated operation located on a continuous and unbroken piece of land. 17 goes on that the interpretation that other buildings must be on part of the overall integrated complex of the hospital is reinforced by Section 24 of the Municipal Assessment Act. On page 43, and I'm going to point you to page 43 or page 8 of the decision 18. The motion judge noted that the reasons for J. Steele were not concurred by the majority of the court, and we need to be open and upfront and honest about this stuff. However, she noted in any event, the case was distinguishable on the basis the property in question was far removed from the hospital. So if a building that's supposed to be associated with a school site, and under the definition of a school building, is far removed from the school, it's still not entitled to exemption. The motion judge held, and I agree, that the decision of J. Steele must be read in the context of the facts of that case. I would also add that J. Steele's comment must be considered in the context of other cases that were being advanced by various health authorities which were attempting to expand the nature of the exemption. For example, St. Boniface General Hospital versus the city assessor. The issue is whether the hospital that delivered insured hospital service from more than one standalone building was entitled to one real property exemption for each building. That was again circled back and reinforced by that the freestanding buildings are part of an integrated operation. So we have our school, we may have associated offices on that 4.07 acres. Page 9 of the assessor's brief, which is, page 44, which is page 9 of, at the top of the page. This again speaks to, I speak to paragraph 21, that the school division in this particular case was not relying on the legislation to expand the exemption of allowable size, nor is it attempting to classify something, parking lot in this case, that would invoke new exemption. Looking at, again, under paragraph 22, the small section, Section 24 recognizes that real property within the 4.047 hectare maximum can include not only other buildings necessary or usual to the operation of a hospital, but also the vacant land abutting these. Again, this is shared language. This is other buildings contained within a 4.0 or a 10-acre exemption. The city is very consistent in this. Every building that's associated with school purposes within the 10 acres is in fact exempted from taxation, whether it's a storage, whether it's office directly associated with that school or required or used for the needs of that school. We are consistent in every respect. The real issue and the real difficulty is, and I touched on it earlier, is how far do you expand? When you look at the modern liberal interior, how far do you expand this? Because we do know, as Mr. Newman pointed out, that we have maintenance facilities and bus storage compounds that are now exempt as schools. Was that the intent of the legislation? How far? If a maintenance facility is exempt because it's a need of a school, then anybody who does work on it is of the need of the school. If a bus storage transportation compound is exempt as a school, then it would seem that anybody who provides bus services for the schools is for the needs of a school and should therefore be entitled. Otherwise, we're narrowing the exemption and we are narrowing the interpretation to the definition. And I think that the definitions stand. Our legal department has represented these properties twice now in the last 2 cycles and basically said the definition stands. That's my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dupuy. The appellants, any questions of the assessor, please?
No, I don't have questions. I'll deal with them in
No, thank you.
Mr. Borgstrom, okay. Mr. Sneesby, any questions of the assessor?
No. I have to think about that twice.
Thank you. Lynn, any questions?
I don't think I do either.
Okay. I guess my only question, Mr. Dupuy, so the evaluation was based on cost approach to value. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in your opinion, it should stay at other property taxable?
That's the city's position, correct?
Because it's not in your opinion, not a school building?
It's not a school as per definition.
Okay. Okay. Any requirement for a summary, Mr. Newman?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So let me pick up with a couple of things that Mr. Dupuy said in his submission. Firstly, he acknowledged that the French version is equally authoritative, and he acknowledged that the language of the French version is used for the needs of a public school. So that's acknowledged. He also said, right towards the end, we have bus storage or maintenance buildings that are now exempt as schools. That's not what we have. We do not have those types of uses or buildings that are exempt as schools. That's the interpretation he's putting upon it, because the argument he makes to you is that there has to be a school on the site. And if, in addition to the school on the site, there is a maintenance building, or a bus storage building, or an office building, or any of a myriad of other uses on the site with a school, then it will be entitled to the exemption. That's the essence of the argument he's making. And that's not what the legislation says. So we need to understand that. And that's why he's able to say, we have bus or maintenance buildings that are now exempt as schools. They're not exempt as schools. Clearly, they are not schools in the sense of buildings where instruction is imparted. Clearly, that's not what they are. But now we have to come back to the legislation, and I have to take you back to page 2 of my submission. And Ms. Nesbitt, you asked me the question about, is the logic of your presentation as follows? And we worked through it, and my answer to you was yes. So now we have to come back to page 2 of my submission, and I'm not going to repeat it at length. But again, the definition of school building is very specific. And it starts with the word includes. Whenever you see the word includes, that's intended to convey a broad scope for what will fall within the basket of what is a school building. So it starts with the word includes, and it includes buildings used in a school division for the imparting of instruction. If it stopped there and said nothing else, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. But it doesn't stop there. It keeps going. And it says, or for offices, or other public school purposes. So clearly, the legislation is intended to capture buildings that have an office use. Because again, it's buildings. It starts with includes the buildings required or used in a school division for the imparting of instruction, or for offices, or other public school purposes. Those words "or" mean it doesn't have to be only the one type of use, it can be any of these uses. And he would say to you, read into that on the same site as a school. But that's not what the legislation says. It doesn't say the office use or the public school purpose use has to be on the same site as a school. And the French version says simply that real property is exempt where it is used for the needs of a public school. Again, it doesn't import any requirement that these other uses have to be, these other buildings have to be on the same site as a school building. So he's reading something into that which is not there. And that's really the gist of the argument that he's making to me. And his reference to the Manitoba Court of Appeal decision, perhaps he misunderstands why I've given you that decision. I'm not giving you that decision. Let's go back a step. That case was all about a school in downtown Winnipeg with a parking lot that was separated by a piece of property owned by a third party. So the parking lot was not part of what I'll call the school site, and it was separated by a piece of property owned by somebody else. And the question was whether, notwithstanding that physical separation, the parking lot could be captured within the school exemption. And the answer from the Court of Appeal was yes. But those aren't our facts. What's important for me out of the Court of Appeal decision is their reference to the French language version. That's really the only reason I bring you that Court of Appeal decision. It's for the reference to the French language version in the fact that the French language version is equally authoritative, which is acknowledged and conceded. So what I'm saying to you simply is, and this building is a little bit more complicated than the next one we're going to do, because there's a mixed use, some of which we acknowledge is not entitled to an exemption. When we get to the next one and you hear about it, you'll see a connection in every aspect of the building use that is tied to the schools and the needs of the schools. But here, because of the definition of school building, a part of a building that is used solely or chiefly for administrative functions of the school division does not fall within the definition of school building. So that's why the administrative functions of the school division, we don't seek the exemption for that. But the rest of it falls within the definition of school building, and by falling into the definition of school building, it's captured by both the English version and the French version. And unless you have questions, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mr. Dupuis.
I have some rebuttal that I'd like to,
Rebuttal.
yeah.
To what, Mr.?
Well, to the evidence and to the verbal evidence presented here today.
Okay, so we weren't, when I asked for a summary, you weren't finished yet. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, okay, well, I guess Mr.
I don't know what it is, so.
Yeah.
You know, if we want to present it on 50 Monterey with reference back to 900, I'm good with that. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, we'll take that. Well, just remind us that you would like it applied, okay? Okay, so any requirement for a summary here?
Well, I mean, other than, you know, the Court of Appeal decision is here, and I think that the wording is very frank. It's very remedial. It's straightforward, and it speaks to the integrated operations. The definition of hospital and the definition of school, neither of them speak to having to have a hospital on the site. But they both speak to other buildings needed or required or used for the needs of that facility or that function. So it's not really implied, it's a judge's determination was simply that needs to fall within the 4.074, meet the definition. And I understand that's supportive of their position, but it's also extremely supportive of our position. It comes down to what's an administrative function of the school division versus what is the needs of a school, an actual particular school.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. I believe that concludes 900 St. Mary's Road. And we will take a 7-minute recess, please.
7 minutes.
Yeah, 7. Not 5, not 10, 7 minutes.
Precise.
I think we're all
Okay, I'll now call the hearing back to order. Next property on the docket is 50 Monterey Road. My understanding is quantum is agreed upon, I believe.
Not in dispute.
Okay, not in dispute, okay. All right. And we're dealing with classification and liability. So Mr. Borgstrom, when you are ready, please.
Thank you. Property address is shown as 50 Monterey Road. It's shown on Realty Assessment Rule number 06044615000. Board revision file number 18529. Property, I'll start off on page 3. It's actually the former William Russell School. And as a little bit of completely useless trivia, it was, I believe, one of the first open classroom concept schools opened in Winnipeg, 1968. My siblings actually attended this school at that time. I did not. I was sort of past that. But it has undergone some renovations and adaptations from its previous use as that elementary school. And it's now used as a repository for centralized services to support student learning and to support the schools as well. There are 3 sort of separate things, if you will, housed in here. One is the Louisville Division's Clinical Service Unit, which includes the division's school psychology services, school social workers, there are speech pathologists, and there are therapy services such as occupational therapists and physiotherapists. A more detailed description of that you'll find in the rear of our submission at page 21 and following. I'm not going to go over it page by page, but it just confirms what it is that I told you is housed within or under the auspices of the Clinical Services Unit. It's also used in part as a centralized repository for facilities planning and maintenance. That provides a central resource for virtually all routine maintenance and major projects, including remodeling and additions for schools. There is also the former gymnasium within the structure is also utilized, but it's used as a temporary storage for various and sundry school equipment, tables and such, and we'll go over some pictures in a moment, which allows for a sharing of common equipment among the schools within a division, or for which school storage space is not actually available for such equipment in the schools themselves. So, property was previously inspected. I believe Mr. Dupuy also attended at the same time on page 8 of our submission. Do I need to pause for a moment to let you catch up? Okay. A couple of exterior shots of the property. Page 9, you'll see there sort of the conference meeting area. You'll see on pages 9 and 10 are part of, I believe, the maintenance, the facilities maintenance operations within there. You'll see in the top picture there sliding doors for plans and so forth. 11, you'll see other space in that juncture. Page 12, you'll see at the bottom, you'll see a common sort of entrance and reception area. Yeah. Page 13, you'll see the auditorium. Page 14, you'll see the entrance and some records being kept in this storage area. Page 15 is actually more storage within here. Page 16 is part of the auditorium, and there you'll see more storage. You'll see tables in there, and various other items, chairs and such. 17, same thing, more storage. 18 is again in the former gymnasium, used for storage. 19, the top picture is one of the meeting rooms used by the Clinical Services Unit. Page Page 19 is again sort of a conference room area. Page 20, again, just shows some of the office area within this space. So to summarize, all of the functions, or let me come at this the other way, none of the functions within this particular building are administrative functions of the school division. They are all in support of the students or for the needs of the public school, the maintenance, the storage of the tables and other equipment that gets transferred back and forth to and from and between the various schools within the division, and the centralized repository for facilities planning and maintenance necessary for the public schools and their efficient and safe operation. And so I think that is the information I wanted to cover here. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Newman again.
So, you know, as I said, in some ways, this building is simpler because it doesn't bring with it the issue of the offices for the administration of the school division. And I would say to you that if you look at Mr. Borgstrom's brief, in particular at starting at page 21, the clinical services unit, made up of psychology services, social workers, speech language pathologists, therapy services. That's what goes on in this building to a very substantial extent. And I have been in the building when it was inspected. And it's not just a situation where these employees of the school division are housed here, but it was told to us that students come to this building on occasion as well to receive the counseling services from these psychologists and speech therapists and all of these others who are there. And you can actually see in one of the photos, because there's occupational therapy that's provided out of this site as well. And if you look at page 10, in the lower photo, you can see the collection of Bosu balls and other physical type aids that are used by these therapists in assisting students who have issues. So when you look at all of these services that go on there, and again, I make the point I made to you earlier, if you had any of these services, if you had the psychologist, if you had the social worker, if you had the speech language pathologist, if you had the occupational therapist or the physiotherapist in a school building, I don't think anybody would say that that school building, the portion of it that's used for those purposes, ought not to be exempt. I think there'd be no question of that. What's creating the issue here is that it's on a separate site, and we've heard Mr. Dupuy's views in the earlier matter, but I'll wait to hear from him again, about the need for a school to be present on a site. So I take you back to the same definitions I addressed with you in the prior submission. Again, you've got the French language version. Clearly offices occupied by physiotherapists or occupational therapists or psychologists. Why are they there? What are they doing? What functions are they performing? They are performing functions that are entirely supportive of the education system, but more particularly of the students within the schools. That's who they're providing their services to. And it's part of what is today a much broader based and more diverse education system than existed when I was going through the school system. And again, the French version, clearly these requirements for these therapeutic and counseling services, they're meeting the needs of the public school. Now, when I went to school, every gymnasium, or the ones I went to school in anyways, had a stage. And underneath the stage, you could store chairs. They'd roll them in and out on carts. The chairs would be laid sideways, and they'd roll them in and out on carts, and they were stored underneath the stage. Not all school gymnasiums have the room for the stage anymore, and so stages tend to be portable now. And indeed, you see in some of these photos, the portable staging. You see chairs, because they move them around. But the need for a stage and the need for chairs in the auditoriums of schools or the gymnasiums of schools are every bit a part of the educational process as the actual school where geography, the actual school room where geography is taught. So, for all the same reasons which I articulated to you in the context of the 900 St. Mary's property, I say to you that what's going on in this building clearly is about meeting the needs of a public school, or clearly is about public school purposes within the definition of school building, and on that basis, the 100% exemption should be granted. Subject to questions, those are our submissions.
Thank you. Mr. Dupuy, any questions of the either appellant?
I have no questions.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, any questions?
Yeah, I was looking at these pictures and that, and there's a lot of storage in relationship to normal school or school support building. And a lot of waste space, if I can use that term. Is there a breakdown of what the functional use square footage area of this property is?
The picture that might be painted in your mind might arise from a poor selection choice on my part of the pictures that I included here. These are not all of the pictures that I took during the inspection, and I perhaps overrepresented the storage in the old gymnasium, if you will. But there is, and as Mr. Newman has pointed out on page 10, that's the storage room for obviously some of the physiotherapy equipment that they use, or the occupational therapy equipment that they use. We don't have a breakdown of occupancy by department within this building. I categorized it as 3 separate occupancies. One would be the clinical services unit, one would be the facilities planning and maintenance area or occupancy, staffing within this building. And the third component would be the old gymnasium. That's where a lot of the tables and chairs and such are stored for distribution on an interim or temporary basis to schools within a division. By recollection, so I don't have a specific breakdown by occupancy within this building, I guess is the short answer.
So are you saying this whole building is exempt, should be exempt?
Yes.
Okay, that was my question.
Thanks, Jerry. Lynn, any questions?
No, I have no questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Borgson, for the record, the assessment currently sits at $1,812,000 other, and you are requesting that it be changed to?
Sorry, 100.
$1,812,000.
$1,812,000 as 40E or institutional exempt.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Okay. All right, that was my only question. Mr. Dupuis, when you are ready, please.
Similarly, I won't, or I'll attempt not to chew up a lot of the board's time here. Starting at page 11, quantum's not an issue, and these are just, again, complementary or similar to the appellant's pictures. These are photos, they're exterior views. They, again, this is a former school, which might answer a bit of questions that the panel member asked with respect to storage and that. It is an old school that's been converted. It's probably, hallways are a little wider than normal. There's some inefficiencies there, obviously. It is simply a school that was converted. And I think the pictures basically show that. Page 11 is the front views, page 12 is the back views and the parking lot views. Page 13, again, the city's position is that this building is administrative in nature. It's for the needs of the school division. It's not for the needs of any particular public school. So we have we have entrances and circulation, central corridors, again, wide hallways. Page 15 is the facilities operations offices. This is the sort of, to coin a phrase used by the appellant, this is the centralized maintenance area. The director of maintenance for the Louisville School Division is here, and his staff and associate clerical staff. And this is the physical area that they utilize, in our opinion, in an administrative capacity to facilitate maintenance and repair on buildings. Page 15, the storage is the former gym. They utilize it for storage. Page 16 is central circulation between the facilities management and the clinical services. There's what they call a teacher's training center on page 17. And clinical services on page 18. The lower part of page 18 is a more tidier picture of the storage room used to store some of the therapy instrumentation or paraphernalia they would use when they go out to the schools and deliver their services at the schools, actually at the schools. Again, our position is this is an administrative function of the clinical. This is where they come back. This is where they do their paperwork. This is the administrative function of the school division with respect to clinical services. Clinical services are not done on this site. They are done in the schools, and the staff attend the schools. At the time of inspection, there was some student-parent activity that they alluded to, and that was a sensitivity issue. Some kids and or parents didn't want to be seen walking in or walking through the school because of potential stigma attached to their child or whatever. So they did suggest they facilitate meetings here. I can tell you that I'm giving sworn testimony, and my child is enrolled in the Louisville School Division and is under clinical psychologist's services. I requested a meeting at this location. She went, well, we don't do that. So, but nevertheless, the evidence at the time, the last appeal at this was that they did suggest for sensitivity reasons they may meet with parents at this facility. Again, it's an administrative, in our opinion, we view it as an administrative function of the school division. Again, I guess I would just point out page 25 of the assessor's brief, the bottom of page O. One of the duties and responsibilities of the school division and the duties of the school boards is to select, purchase, or rent school sites and/or premises, and build, repair, furnish, keep in order, and regulate the use of school buildings, land enclosures, movable properties. There's no doubt that they would require a facility and staff to meet those obligations. That would be an administrative function of the school division, not a need of a school in particular. Page 27, 28, 29 are previous, this has been appealed previous 2 cycles. These are the decisions. I can leave it at that. And I won't pound through the legislation again, other than to suggest that the Court of Appeal decision, other than to suggest that this just upholds a Queen's Bench decision which suggested that a parking lot was part of a school facility and tied that parking lot directly, specifically named to Sister McNamara School. And it would seem to me that if we're going to suggest that these are for the needs of a school, then perhaps one would need to tie this exemption back to a particular school in a similar fashion. That's my presentation. I'm open for questions.
Thank you. Any questions of the assessor, Mr. Boardroom or Mr. Newman?
I have no questions, thank you.
Okay. So, Lynn, any questions?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
And Jerry, any questions?
Yeah, do you, I'm just looking at the aerial photo and the other photos, I mentioned this before. Would you, is this building grossly underutilized? I mean, look at the parking photos of the parking lot, it's totally empty. And look at the building, and you see piles of furniture. You don't see people, they're either because of the social issues that it might be involved, that they don't want, nobody wants to be seen there, or,
I can tell you my impression is simply that it's with respect to the circulation, the extra wide hallways, et cetera, it's underutilized. The actual occupied areas are pretty significant. They do have what they call a teacher's training center. They will use this location for certain in-service type work as well. So, on those particular days, that parking lot will see a lot of use, but other than that, yes, the land is probably underutilized. Other than it's there and it's accessible to the public, the kids will still use it as a playground and a sports ground and stuff, the neighborhood kids. But as far as the school division, I would agree with everybody's interpretation that it's probably underutilized.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Dupuy, is there a pending Queen's Bench appeal on this
Yes.
property? Okay,
Yeah.
and it's based on the principles as presented on both sides today, would that be fair? The arguments that are being presented?
I think that.
I think it's fair. It's fair, absolutely.
Okay. And Before we go to summary, I believe Mr. Newman would like a summary first. Any rebuttal at all?
I have some rebuttal,
Okay.
if I may. And I'd like to give Altus an opportunity just to review quickly, if they need to.
I've not seen it, so.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen it, so, do you want to have a quick look before I hand it? Actually, I'm not going to refer to much of it at all.
16. Well, there's a lot of information in here, and I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure
Okay. You know, maybe.
what its probative value as rebuttal is. There seems to be a lot of new information.
Yeah, okay, so you know what I'm gonna say? I think Mr. Dupuy referenced that he isn't gonna refer to a lot of it. Would it be fair to you that if it's crossing a line between rebutting what you presented and presenting new evidence, you object at that time? Or do you object to this, or are you okay with this evidence being presented as rebuttal?
I can tell you that it directly rebuts the paper evidence and the evidence given here today in every respect. But I'm not going to burden the board with a bunch of it because just based on some of the evidence today, I have a better understanding of why they did what they did in a couple of cases, so I really don't need to reference it.
Well, is it possible that you don't present this as rebuttal, because it's gonna come in the record, the whole package on the record? Is it possible you can reference certain points that you'd like to question or rebut the appellants on verbally?
Well, it's pretty hard. I mean, the evidence here is suggesting the alternative. And let's just put it this way. The school division's evidence here directly rebuts their interpretation. It's a direct contradiction of what they're suggesting.
It seems to me that Mr. Dupuy is crossing the line into argument rather than rebuttal on this.
It directly rebuts your point.
Of usage of the facilities, for instance?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, okay. I think we're gonna, well, no, I don't think, we are gonna allow the rebuttal to be presented, but the panel is gonna, I would ask that you keep your question, or your evidence directly related to what they presented, and the panel will decide how much weight they're gonna put on specific items, okay?
Certainly.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Dupuy, when you're ready, please.
Thank you. If you look in the bottom lower right corner, the pages are numbered, and I would just get you initially to turn to page 13 of the rebuttal. This is, I'm sorry, I should maybe have referenced page 8. This is the annual report to the community, 27-2018. Page 13 says, this is their senior leadership team. This is their directors. And you have a director of student support services, director of information systems, director of facilities. Mr. Roberts is located at 50 Monterey. That's his area, and his support staff and his offices are located there. And quite simply, the senior leadership team works with managers and coordinators at the division level, along with principals and vice principals, to undertake the work of the division. These directors and their staff and the areas they locate are at a division level and simply support exactly what we've said, that they serve an administrative function and need of the school division, not any particular public school. There's areas within 900 St. Mary's that they're exempting or seeking exemption for, which are directly related to the areas occupied by these people who work at a division level, not at a school level. They facilitate the needs of the school division in an administrative capacity.
Okay?
We know that students do not attend this location for school support services. What we do have is a director who has an obligation under the Public Schools Act. Similarly, the director of facilities has directed as a duty of the school division, and again, their own documentation suggests that they work at a school division level, not at a.
So in summary, you're saying some of these people.
So in summary, I'm saying that
They're located
the
at the subject
facilities, you know, you really need to narrow the definition. you know, I tried to suggest through some of the pictures here, I don't know if they have any problem with the pictures, starting on page 19, that these are schools that have portable classrooms and/or facilities attached to them that are exempted as other buildings associated with that school. Sort of supportive of the Court of Appeal documentation, would seem to be in conflict or directly opposed to what the appellants are seeking today. Page 22, they can object if they want. This is just tab 4 of their brief. This is a facility, and I will not say Mr. Newman, out of respect for Mr. Newman, and I do respect Mr. Newman. These are not exempted, this is not exempted as a school, it's exempted as the needs of the school division. This is a maintenance facility.
You don't have to say that out of
Yeah.
respect. That was our position.
Right, so.
We weren't saying it was
I'm-
exempt
So
as a
I'm
school.
correcting myself, Mr. Newman, I'm correcting myself, I'm not suggesting, now, it was exempted as a school. You're, you know,
No.
and
It was not.
it's exempted as for the needs of a school. So, in looking at that, I would turn to page 23. And this is first student transportation service, which does about 80% of the bus services for Louisville School Division. Now, we've been told that contractors would not fall under that liberal definition of for the needs of a public school. Looking at page 22, and this was determined to be the needs of a public school, I don't see how this could not be determined under the liberal definition or the liberal interpretation of not being for the needs of a public school.
Well, I guess you should give it an exemption then.
Well, maybe I should. And maybe I should exempt transit for the needs of the school, and maybe I should be exempting the Minister of Education's office for the needs of the school, because I think we all agree that pretty much everything is for the needs of a public school. Every aspect. I don't think any of us can really argue that from top to bottom, it's for the needs of a public school. But what we did establish today is that the legislation is set up to suggest, and I mean, it states that there's taxable components to a school division. What are those taxable components? Again, it comes down to a definition. What's an administrative function versus what is an actual need of the school?
Okay. Okay,
And that's my summary too.
any questions arising at all from this? Okay. I think we have a clear picture of which direction both sides are coming from.
I do want a bit of a summary. So
Of course.
But I've got no questions.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions about it? Okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Dupuy. Mr. Newman. Summary, please.
So I think Mr. Dupuy essentially made one point, which is that their position is that what goes on in this building at 50 Monterey is administrative in nature, and it's not for the needs of any particular public school. That's the point he's making to you. And he'll say that this is the place where the psychologists and the social workers come to do their paperwork, and therefore it's administrative. And he will say, and does say, that we are not able to tie the exemption back to a particular school. And I will answer that by saying, oh yes, we can. Because I will say that every single school that one of these psychologists go to, every single school that one of these therapists go to, every single school that the maintenance services relate to is a particular school. I think the distinction that needs to be made is, and in his rebuttal material, he's got the, on page 13, I'm gonna call it the Wall of Fame. He's got the pictures of the senior management. And, you know, you've got the superintendent and the secretary treasurer and the assistant superintendents. These are the most senior, statutorily created officers of school divisions. We have never suggested that the premises they occupy and the building they work out of or a part of it should be exempt. But there's a very real distinction between the administrative functions of the school division, and I mean that at large, as opposed to a psychologist or a social worker or an occupational therapist going back to their office and doing their paperwork, which relates to the students they're dealing with, who are in a particular school. There's a very real distinction between that and the secretary treasurer or the superintendent or that level of official. And I think that's ultimately really the point he's making to you, is that this is administrative and it's not serving the needs of a public school in the French version, or it's not serving a public school purpose. And I say to you simply, as I did earlier, clinical services are all about the students. It's only about the students. It's about making their experience through the education process a better one and a more productive one. That is all that it is about. And to suggest that in some way that is not about the needs of a public school or a public school purpose, I think is not appropriate. I don't think it's realistic, and I think ultimately that you should grant the exemption. And Mr. Sneesby, just to a point you were making about the underutilization of the facility, and in fairness, I think Mr. Dupuy addressed this with you. It was designed as a school. And with that comes the functional limitations of that design, which of course includes large hallways for a throng of students passing through those hallways. When you don't have that throng of students, you don't need those large hallways, but they're not about to reconstruct the building to make the hallways smaller, so it is what it is. But ultimately, I think what's more important is not so much the efficiency of the space as we might typically measure it in the context of an office use, for example. What's more important is how is it being used, and is it meeting the needs of the legislation? And you've heard me on that point. So unless Brad has anything to say, we'll stop there.
Just nothing to add to that, just a quick correction on the assessor's evidence, rebuttal on his page 23. Now, I'm a little familiar with this property and it clicked with me. The picture that you see on the bottom there is not at 31 Paul. It's actually on a separate roll number showing up as 3051 St. Mary's Road. So the only part that is actually 31 Paul runs from about the tree line here over to the back of the building, which you see at the bottom here. So it does include a residential home at the front there. I don't know if it continues to remain the same circumstance. At one time, a few years ago, that was actually leased by the bus company to store buses there. I don't know if they own it or not. Can't speak to that, but I can tell you that the building at the bottom, shown on his rebuttal, is not part of 31 Paul. Okay. Separate road.
Okay. Thank you.
And Mr. Boardroom is correct.
Okay.
It is still the same owner 31 Fall. It's addressed on St. Mary's.
All right.
It's the same facility.
Two separate roll numbers.
Two separate roll numbers, the same facility, the same owner, and the same purpose.
All right. Okay, so Mr. Newman has kindly done your summation for you. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, certainly.
Hopefully fairly.
Certainly. All I will add is just a quick, and I've said it here today, that it should be apparent that every single consideration in absolutely every aspect of this ultimately comes down to the needs of those students that Mr. Newman had referred to. There isn't a single aspect that isn't for that doesn't reflect and come right down to the needs of the student. What we're talking about is what is for the needs of a school, a public school, the facility, the bricks and mortar facility. What is administrative versus what is actual school?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both parties. That concludes 50 Monterey Road, and that concludes our hearing, and you'll be hearing from us in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Good thing you only had two on the docket.
Yeah, no kidding.